Ron, thanks for coming on the show.
Kyle, how's it going?
It's going awesome. I'm really excited to talk to you here. Again, this topic is something that I think is just so perfect for you. As I've told you previously, I've heard your name so many times through the broader cybersecurity ecosystem, both within DC, but then also just more broadly. You've had obviously quite an impact, and I'm really curious to see how networking has played a role for you and what lessons we as an audience and myself included might be able to glean from this conversation. So maybe just to kick off this whole conversation, what is your philosophy on networking? Like if you were to distill it down into a sentence or two, how do you go about thinking about networking, using your network to your advantage, but then still making it beneficial for everyone involved and making it feel very natural?
Yeah, you have to separate the potential for friendship, the potential for financial gain, the potential for, I'll just call, not being at the right level. There's all sorts of different theories that are out there. Probably the worst thing that people can do to me when they meet me after they do is ask me to come on a podcast. No, I'm just joking. The question's like, hey, can we do lunch and can I pick your brain? And I don't know who's out there telling people like that's the best way to cut, but that's like some of the worst things, because it's sort of like it kind of demeans all the experience that you have. And I've found myself, asking that, when I was younger and stuff. But the real question now is like, what are your goals? And if your goals are something that aligns with the people you're networking, then you should probably build that network. But to meet for the sake of meeting or because it's tough, you really got to figure out why you're networking. I think a lot of people who are professional networkers, you got to be careful because some of them are paid to do these kind of things. And then, some of them are kind of just really, they want to be part of the ecosystem, and, being in part of the ecosystem is not necessarily there. So that's a fluffy answer to a hard question. I think the last thing I would say though, is that a lot of times I find people who are networking, they've got FOMO, right? They've got fear of missing out. They've got, if they're not in the right crowd, they're not going to be at the right place. And I don't know that that's true or not. You need to kind of step up and share yourself out there. But at the same time, we'll see how that goes.
Like you said, a little bit of a fluffy answer, but that's exactly what I set you up for there. And let's unpack that a little bit further. I think you're totally right. The compelling nature of an invitation for something like lunch depends sometimes on how specific it is. Oftentimes, I think the first reaction of folks might be to say, oh, if someone just wants to pick my brain, they probably want to sell me something, right? Which is, I would say from my experience, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, but probably the number one reason people don't want to network is they don't want to just feel like they're being pitched to 24/7. They want to build more of a relationship there. But you picked out a couple of different elements to isolate the idea of friendship versus professional opportunities. I mean, can you drill into this a little bit more? Maybe how you've gone about the idea of specifically picking what I want this relationship to be, and even at what point into meeting a person can you make that decision?
Yeah. So it's like dating, and not that I'm a dater. I've been happily married for 25 years, but right. There is a lot of this. If you're going to have somebody who is going to be a mentor to a person who's getting into the career, that's one thing. If you actually have an agenda, like you're trying to recruit people to your company, you're trying to recruit an investor, trying to recruit advisors, that's a completely other thing. So the real question is like, what are your goals with networking? And I often see people confuse being famous with being successful, and or wanting to be perceived to be successful by hanging out with successful people versus actually trying to kind of meet with them. There's a thing I have in investing called the 5-slide pitch deck. It's what problem do you solve? How do you solve it? Show me some proof. What are you gonna do with the money? But then what's your vision of success? And what's your vision of success comes really into focus with who you want to hang out with and who you want to network with. Are those people interested in your success and the success of you or your company? That should be like the primary reason for wanting to network with people.
So thinking about that in a more practical sense, right? That creates maybe a great challenge if you're going to like a conference, let's say, trying to meet people at this conference. most of these people probably aren't going to have any interest in your success if you just talk to them for a few minutes. So how would you think about the idea of, okay, I want to make sure that I meet people at a surface level, but then maybe you triage from that initial group and say, hey, from these initial conversations, who are the people that are actually going to be valuable to me long term because they are interested in my success and I'm interested in their success? Is that just kind of the next level of networking for you after that initial touch point?
If we're going to focus on cybersecurity startups,
Sure.
I would tell people you should network with other cybersecurity startups in your region, people at your stage. They could be in the portfolio of a fund who's invested in you. It could be in your geographical region. It could be in your state region. It could be, so you could even be hanging out with competitors. But then when you get to be bigger, the question is, why do you want to network? So if you're in cybersecurity and you're starting companies, you're probably going to have to deal with things like, should I move to Florida to avoid the Virginia, Maryland, DC tax rate? Well, who are you going to want to network with? Other people who've been there, done that, right? So this gets back to like the whole reason, why would you meet? So if you have a financial advisor and they want to introduce you to somebody, maybe they view you as that person who's struggled with this problem and done that. Maybe it's more intimate. Like maybe you've gone through a divorce and you're a high net worth individual, you're dealing with, how do you value options in a divorce, case settlement, right? These are really, really important things to network versus, hey, can you give me some career pointers for doing this and that? Not a lot of people ask for that stuff, really mean it. What they're really asking for is, can you be a mentor? Can you be an advisor? Can you be an investor? And it just goes back to, what do you want out of that networking event?
So let's maybe talk in some more concrete examples here, because again, it sounds like you have this very fine-tuned approach to networking. It says there are specific things that you want to network for. So be upfront about that and find out those people who have that exact information or experience that you're looking for. What's a time maybe as you were building Tenable that you faced this new problem you didn't have experience with and you were able to either work through your network through a couple of different branches in order to find someone, or just had someone there immediately who was available to help you?
That's a really interesting question. So before Tenable, Cindy and I, my wife, we did a company called Network Security Wizards.
Right.
And I was told through my network, right, that it would be really good to have a CEO who was a little bit older and maybe more experienced and whatever. And I brought somebody like that in, and that wasn't the best advice. So we also had people say, hey, you should go meet the community and try to network with people in the community. I actually went out to a local like economic development authority, and this was before cyber was a thing. And on one side of me, there was somebody who had literally just opened up like a cookie store, and person to the right of me sold real estate. And cookies and real estate are very important, but it was kind of hard to network. There was nothing in common. So then when we start doing Tenable, we kind of started, we're recording this in September of 22, just before, hopefully not a bad recession, whatever, but like the internet bubble had burst. So most of my networking was with VCs who were telling me that they didn't want to fund us, or that they didn't like open source. They didn't think vulnerabilities were like the vulnerability scanning and management just wasn't a sexy thing, right? So it wasn't like we were getting all sorts of opportunities for networking. We were also told, hey, you're on the East Coast. If you really want to network, you should move out to the West Coast. So some of my initial sort of networking experience with Tenable was negative. It really wasn't the feedback that I was looking for.
Okay, and so you're getting all these different sources who are telling you various pieces of information. I think startups in particular is very interesting because there are these common trends in terms of how to do something. Those trends evolve over time pretty substantially. And part of the reason they evolve is usually people going against the trend and then succeeding. And I think Tenable is an interesting example of that in itself, in terms of just being able to tackle across both coasts instead of just being focused in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And obviously now we've seen a great cybersecurity ecosystem evolve in the DC metro area. So you're getting all of this advice from people who, again, are kind of thinking along that conventional wisdom. Was there anyone in particular that you spoke to within your network who maybe had the advice to just go for what you had in mind, or like a specific person that was really influential there?
Yeah. So Tenable had, an interesting time. A lot of this it's all public knowledge now. It's a public company and whatnot. But the vast number of venture capital folks that we talked to, I didn't realize until my co-founder, Jack Hufford, was like, look, you have to realize that when you raise money from venture capital, you're the product. I mean, Tenable, we sell a product, right? We sold Nessus Security Center, Tenable IO, and whatnot. But from a venture capital point of view, you're the product. So not raising any venture, most of the feedback we were getting from networking was, you should raise money. You should raise money. We'll make you more successful. Success was all about raising money. It wasn't about growing a company. So in many ways, I was hanging out with the wrong people. But there was a gentleman from Excel Partners named Ping Lee, who would meet with us at every Black Hat for a couple years in a row. And then he was the one who joined our board and led the first $50 million raise that Tenable did. And it was that sort of mentorship and the conversations, the trust that really was it was a two-way confidence, right? That was a big raise. That was a record-setting raise at the time. And that was just really, really fortunate that way.
Interesting. And I guess this goes back to what you've already been talking about in terms of themes, right? So this person who had a specific reason for interacting with you, but it was very kind of straightforward, and he also had your best interest in mind, which is why you trusted him more. And that relationship was built over a period of, it sounds like, 3 or 4 years, as opposed to being formed at Black Hat that year and then the investment being made 2 months later. So exactly. that time horizon piece.
And it just goes that when people are asking for advice and they're networking, you have to kind of understand who's that person on the other side. Why would they want to network with you? What are they going to get out of it? Nothing is a zero-sum game, in life. But if you're, I think people, when they talk networking, it's kind of cool to hang out with the cool kids, so to speak. But why do the cool kids want to hang? What makes you cool? Why is it a two-way street? And that's a really, really hard thing for people to understand.
Right. And so going back to this example of Ping Lee, right? It sounds like there was so much demand to invest in Tenable at this point. I'm sure you had plenty of different options, but how did maybe that relationship with Ping Lee also influence the other investors that were actually involved on the deal? Like, did you end up bringing in other Excel partners as secondary investors just based off of that Ping Lee relationship?
Yeah. So the way that kind of works when you raise that amount of money is typically they join your board. There's a board observer role. And, we try to emulate this a lot at Gula Tech Adventures today, where it's not just the person on the board. You kind of get access to the full staff, so to speak. What was interesting, though, if you go back to the early, 2000s, that first decade, there were a lot of companies out there who were raising $300 million, $200 million with no revenue, like with just a website and a product and stuff like that. So some of the funds who were investing in those companies were coming to Tenable and looking at us, and our partners. So Renaud Darrison, who's our CTO, Jack Huffer, I mentioned, we would go on these fundraising, trips, and we'd meet with these people, we'd do a good pitch, but then we'd go to some of their events and we'd be like, holy cow, that company has zero revenue. And we had $50 million at that point, and maybe we should be worth $3 trillion based on their dynamic, and of course that's not the way it was, but it was kind of an interesting dynamic looking at that.
Right. And certainly parallels with different things that we see today, right? In some of these spaces, I mean, Web3 in particular, that's for another conversation, I think. Let's talk more about that kind of core nexus of folks that you had at the top at Tenable, right? So you had these different co-founders. You mentioned Jack, and then obviously your wife, Cindy, who's been involved with the business for a very long period of time. And I imagine after an extended period of time working with one of these people, you're going to have a lot of network overlap, right? Where all of a sudden you kind of start to know the same people, which means that each of your individual relationships are somewhat less valuable in aggregate if there's so much overlap. How did you approach that problem? What were those kind of networks like originally? And what did you do to make sure that you and your other team members were still kind of investing in different angles to grow that reach?
Well, running a company like Tenable, I was really lucky to have really a lot of great people involved. Obviously, Jack Hubbard and Renaud Darrison, my wife Cindy, but Steve Vince, our CFO. As we grew over the years, people's roles changed and who went to what. Like it used to be me and Jack on the road show. And then, later on when we were doing sort of the last round before the company went public, it was Steve Vince and I. And then after I left, Jack took over a lot of that kind of stuff. So these roles change a lot over time. I've always been the more public one. If you look at the past, I guess, 18 years of Tenable or so, but public's a weird thing. Like speaking to an investor conference is still a public role, but maybe that's more appropriate for a CFO or a president. Speaking about product demos, maybe it's more appropriate for me or Renault. And every opportunity that comes up, you kind of want to be able to go and support it. But one of the things Tenable really, really did well is we brought a lot of very senior subject matter experts in who could go out, speak to a partner, speak at a customer conference, and speak sort of with the voice of Tenable. So we were able to scale quite well.
Yep, totally makes sense. So, I mean, I guess shifting the different roles within the organization, which then allows each of those individuals who are kind of at the helm publicly to access the different elements of their network as a result. So even if someone like Renee was kind of in the background to begin with, when it was the road shows that you and Jack were doing, when they got a chance to kind of take over, they would have more opportunity to leverage the different folks in their network more directly, which gave you that kind of combined benefit that you're talking about.
Yeah, and there's networks, and then there's networks. Like a lot of times we would get involved with Excel partners. They would do portfolio CEO networks, and I can remember being in a room with all of the leading 8 to 10 cybersecurity execs at the same time, and we're literally just doing a dinner with like John Chambers and stuff like that. And that's pretty cool stuff to do. And I also kind of remember meeting more than once some of the competitors of Tenable, where it was just me and the CEO of Qualys or the CEO of Rapid7. And those are also very interesting network things, because even though you're competing with people, you want to see the market go a certain way. You want to see customers behave a certain way. And there's a lot of concerns that you have growing a company that you can network and share that way.
So I'm curious, I'm sure there were all sorts of kind of broader market landscape discussions that you were having with the CEOs of Qualys, for example. Were there ever times where like the CEO of Qualys then connected you with someone else that ended up driving additional value for your business?
Yeah, a lot of times it has to do with moving people around, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. And we have people leave Tenable, go to work at other places, and vice versa. If you're going to do diligence on somebody who worked at a competitor, I mean, maybe you left under false circumstances, maybe you left under good circumstances. And I'm not like saying these conversations happen, every day of the week, but it's nice to have, that. I always tell people, I mean, your show's all about networking. You should know who your competitors are, because you probably do have common interest with them. Working with people, which is a precious commodity, is a really good line of conversation that you want to have. You can't treat them as the enemy, and we're not going to have any conversation with these people at all. So it's a good form of networking.
Right. And certainly beneficial for the industry as a whole as well, when everyone's a little bit more collaborative at the top instead of completely at one another's throats. And like you said, just some mutually shared benefits. If you go back and forth on the hiring pieces, then you're not making the same mistakes hiring those individuals over and over again, which is just wasting both of your times. So let's move on a little bit and then talk about the relevance of networking as it pertains to Gula Tech Adventures, right? I think VC as a whole is very well known for its reliance on networking a lot of times. And obviously, when it comes to limited partners, those who are actually investing in Gula Tech Adventures, those network relationships can have a big impact. So is there anyone in particular within your LP group that has been kind of fundamental in connecting you with the rest of this broader LP network, and just how has that evolved?
So it's interesting. So with Gula Tech, we're kind of spending Gula dollars, so we don't really have
Sure.
LPs and whatnot. But having said that, we looked at this industry, this region is really what I meant to say, a little bit differently than we look at maybe Boston or Silicon Valley. So you got Virginia, you got Maryland, you've got the DC area, but you also have sort of the NSA cyber people and the CIA cyber people. You also have people who do government services work and people who do commercial services work. You also have product vendors. You also have people who maybe have strong contacts with the West Coast or international. So we've basically met most of the people in the regions, and that's kind of given our background from Tenable and the fact that we've deployed over $100 million into various companies and whatnot. So that gives us a lot of entree to places. Some of them are even on the political side of things, where you get to meet state-sponsored economic development things and whatnot. So my point is like there's a lot of people that we've talked with. I wouldn't say it was just one or the other. I think we have a very unique perspective of that. There's people out there, there's funds that focus nothing except former CIA startups, right? There's other funds who do nothing except tech transfer, and stuff from the government and whatnot. And I just think we've done a decent job, networking with most of these folks in the region. When I say networking, you go to their events, you speak at their events, you do diligence on the companies that they have that are raising money. You possibly invest in those companies. If you say no, you give that diligence back. It's a full sort of conversation. And just within the region, I mean, I see Interloop Capital doing that. I see Squatter doing that. I see Data Tribe doing that. I see people like Michael Sutton, former CISO at Zscaler, Stone Mill Ventures, doing that. But I also see the economic development things doing that all across the country, the various conferences and whatnot. There's too many to name.
Right. And I think even as you keep talking about this approach to networking, it just further highlights that strategy that you mentioned earlier, right? Of one of the initial examples you gave was, okay, moving to Florida from DC. So this very location-centric networking concept. And now you're talking about, what about the folks who are focused on specific government agencies that all have the cluster of individuals in their network within that agency, or international governments and the cluster of folks that dedicated individuals will have there? I mean, this leads me to maybe another question. Do you find that certain people are more valuable if they have a niche group of connections as opposed to just connections more broadly, because they give access to a group that's otherwise maybe more difficult to reach?
It gets back to your goal. Like, let's say you're starting a classified recruiting agency where you want to recruit cleared talent. Well, certain groups that tend to cater to cleared talent, you're going to be highly interested in networking and those kind of things. We get asked to speak and participate in stuff like that, but a very small percentage of our portfolio maintains cleared people. So that's just not kind of our thing. On the other hand, there's things that we're interested in from a ecosystem point of view. What can we do to get the people who are high net worth individuals, but not necessarily cybersecurity? What can we do to get them to invest in startups? Can they work with their colleges, their community, their economic development authorities? We're happy to go to those things as well. But again, that's not the majority of what we do. And then, of course, when you have a big name, venture capital group comes into town and they want to do an event, or a lot of times these banking organizations, Silicon Valley Bank, they'll put on events, and you will see a lot of those kind of folks. Wells Fargo is doing this kind of stuff as well. So it's another form of networking, but it's the base. We're going to be in a room at the same time. We're going to introduce each other. Maybe that's your initial point of contact, and not necessarily a long-term networking relationship.
I also think you've brought up a theme time and time again over the course of this conversation, and you just said it again right there: being in the room together, attending these events, being a speaker at these events, when someone comes to town, right? And all of these imply a sort of physical proximity to one another, but at the same time, now more and more things are moving remote, and it gives you access to a wider variety of people if you're able to network remotely. I mean, obviously, we're taking this call remotely right now. So what are your thoughts on just handling the remote outreach capabilities that exist today, and how you prioritize your time on network relationships that are more proximity based as opposed to maybe more remote?
We're definitely remote, but it looks like we're in the same room, doesn't it? We got the same exact background.
Yeah,
it's not a Zoom
nice
background. This is a wall right here. It's pretty funny. But to the point of remote networking, let's take about, my guess is most of your viewers are going to be people who view remote panels, conferences that are online. So the panelist is not going to remember your question. They're probably not going to get your contact info. So you're going to have to hit them up on LinkedIn. And sending people LinkedIn connections, that's really tough. Hi, I met you at I saw you speak at a conference. I'd like to connect with you. I think most people in the industry are going to do a connection, but you start sending 4 or 5 really good questions after that, that's too many, right? You send one, it doesn't show enough interest. It's really hard. So the question is, like, if you're going to reach out to somebody and link in with them, why do you want to link in with them? If you're really upfront, you're really honest, you're looking for mentors, you're looking for investors, you're looking for advice on a question, there's a lot of people who abuse those kind of connections out there. So there's a lot of people who are going to be really, really guarded. Now, as you switch to in-person, I really think it's important for people, and this is going to sound really silly, you've got to rehearse who you are, your name, and what you do. You can't have a 3-minute introduction. If you get a chance to introduce yourself, you need to have a tweetable, memorable thing that is, it's going to be more to your style. It could be humble, it could be something interesting, and it can't be a gimmick, but it's got to be aligned with your goals, so that people understand you and think that you're a human being and that you're working on the same problems that they are.
The elevator pitch is the classic terminology, right? But I love that you use the concept of tweetable and just the succinctness that implies. So, I mean, let's talk about cybersecurity specifically, because I think everything we've talked about so far applies across just about every industry, every role. And I mean, even the theme that you've mentioned of finding the specifics implies some cybersecurity implications. But what do you think is kind of key as you think about networking within the cybersecurity industry? Maybe how people are potentially more guarded as a result of phishing, for example, and just being hacked, the kind of extra skepticism that exists with cybersecurity professionals as opposed to other industries.
Yeah, so folks who are in the cybersecurity industry, there's really a bunch of different ways to break it down. I already kind of went through my NSA, CIA, public,
Right.
private, whatever. But one way is are you a vendor who's producing something, a service, a consultancy, a product, a SaaS offering? And then are you a consumer, somebody who's looking for a cybersecurity job, somebody who's running a product, somebody who needs to be certified, somebody who needs to be compliant, a CISO who might eventually be a whistleblower and testify before Congress, right? So I kind of split people into these two groups. Both of them have their pros and cons of networking. A lot of times, if you're a vendor, even if you're an investor in a vendor, the conversation with the people who your potential customers are, the assumption is they just want to sell me something. And if you're on the CISO side of things, and you're trying to look for people, you're trying to hire them, question is should I hire this person? So it's everybody's got this kind of in the back of their mind when they're meeting people. What's the best way to approach this? How do you do it? It's one of the reasons we don't have like CISO advisory boards or anything like that. I try to maintain my friendships and maintain my points of contact and keep them up. And I'll talk to people a bunch, like, oh, that's a tough problem. Here's companies we've invested in that area. Here's 2 or 3 different mousetraps ways to look at this. And that's kind of useful. But for folks who are in cybersecurity, you're right, there's such a mountain of technology and threats and risks. It can be inundating just to keep up with it.
And so, any recommendations for getting around that?
Yeah, the first of all is know what you know, and don't try to blow smoke. Don't try to be more than what you're saying, because the resources are so few. If anybody's capable, you're going to have a decent career here. If your product is capable, you're going to eventually find customers for that. And there's techniques for both of those things. I'll give you a bad example. I recently spoke at an event. There was some networking after. I met a young African American man. His first question to me on LinkedIn was, "Can you help me find a federal sales lead?" I don't know what his company does. I don't know how he sells. I don't know what he pays. I don't know. And so the context there was really, really not good, because if I recommend somebody something, I have to be careful sometimes recommending, just because of my background and the connections that we have and whatnot. On the other hand, I think the young man who was talking to me was like, I'm kind of surprised that my first questions were so intimate after that, like, because it's just, it kind of assumes a lot. So this happens, this sort of impedance mismatch of people who can help you and people who need help. It happens quite a bit in cybersecurity.
Okay, so to get towards the conclusion of the episode here, is there any like one person who has a specific network that you're looking for today that you are actively pursuing? Again, you've talked about this whole networking with a purpose idea. Any kind of gaps in your current network that you're actively looking to fill?
I'm not, but I'm also fairly
Okay.
humble to say that I'm also not like assuming that we've got everywhere. We've got really good relationships with other funds. We've got really good relationships with the nonprofit world. We've got really good relationships with government agencies, but that's a unique product of who we have at Gula Tech and our background and what we're doing. One of the things that we're trying to do is focus on the U.S. So a lot of times we do get asked to, hey, can you network with the German people who are visiting cyber, the Israeli folks, or whoever. Those are, where our focus tends to be U.S. based things. So we're not trying to look outside that. And anytime we can work with somebody to encourage people to go into cybersecurity, we will talk your ear off about a concept we have called data care. Basically, trying to get people who are outside of cyber to really think about cybersecurity like the healthcare industry, where everybody has a role and a responsibility. And you might be a nurse, you might be a brain surgeon, you might be on a help desk, you might be doing incident response on Chinese malware. It's all the same thing. And that is one form of networking outside of our industry we'll almost always never say no to.
Right. And I think I saw something that Cindy gave a presentation on that recently. So I'll try and include that in the show notes as well, so folks can go ahead and take a look at what that whole data care concept means in a bit more detail. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ron. Again, really appreciate the time. I think you had some spot on recommendations in terms of just how to think about networking more tactically in a way that's still mutually beneficial for both parties. So it's not that you're trying to hide your motives and just pretend that you're being friendly with someone for the sake of being friends, but understanding that, hey, everyone in the professional context is trying to improve their careers one way or another. And how can you be upfront as far as what your needs are and how you address the needs of someone else, and being respectful through that whole process.
Well said. Thanks for the opportunity to discuss all that, Kyle.